W.H.R. Rivers. Osler, first physician-in-chief of the Johns Hopkins Hospital and later Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford, is considered one of the most influential physicians in history. As a doctor and teacher, he was profoundly interested in healing and what makes a great healer. Osler's primary interest was in clinical practice and the scientific study of medicine, but he advised young doctors to read broadly in the humanities and taught them the judicious use of faith and suggestion in medical practice. Osler was very much engaged in the First World War, both as consultant physician to the British Army hospitals and as the father of a young soldier killed on the Western Front. He came to know the limits of healing. This first part of the book focuses particularly on the medical psychologist, physician, and anthropologist W.H.R. Rivers, and on his psychotherapeutic work with Siegfried Sassoon, prominent among the war poets. To his practice, Rivers brought not only medical training, but also his experience as an anthropologist who had studied cultures different from his own. He had learned from their healing rituals and ways of death, from their gods and languages and arts, and from their ways of survival. Psychotherapy, Rivers wrote, was an attempt to check disease by measures that act through the mind, an approach based on the link that has existed throughout history between medicine on the one hand and magic and religion on the other. The earliest ways of healing were psychotherapeutic, Rivers believed, and if the remedies of existing peoples of rude culture provide any indication of primitive modes of thought and action, psychotherapeutics would seem to be the oldest branch of medicine. Siegfried Sassoon detected these ancient roots of healing in his psychotherapy with Rivers. "Your soul is full of cities with dead names," he wrote, "and earthbound gods of bronze and stone." Rivers's understanding of him, he said, was out beyond the boundaries of my brain. Theirs was, in Sassoon's description, an archetypal healing relationship, a profound journey. What took place in Rivers's consulting room at the Craig Lockhart War Hospital for shell-shocked officers provided Sassoon with a way to approach suffering. It gave him capacity to carry forward. Rivers learned from Sassoon and his other patients, and the insight obtained from therapeutic encounters made its way not only into clinical practice, but into medical and psychiatric journals as well. It was the uses of memory, what best to remember and reconstrue, what best to forget, that engaged the imagination of many of the war poets and doctors. The poets wrote about the horror of what they had seen and done at the Western Front. They wrote to pull meaning from the acts and costs of war and to preserve the memory of those who otherwise would be forgotten. Several of the poets felt a duty to hold accountable those who were responsible for the horror, and to make the horror plain to those who had not fought. They wrote to make others see, to make it hard for them to cast off and move on. "Soldier should remember soldier," Sassoon wrote. "Do you remember that hour of din before the attack? And the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads, those ashen gray masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay? Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget." To remember the dead and the maimed, to know the faces of the insane, to bear witness to the men they had commanded or served with, was to start to heal. To write about the war was to shape its terror and futility into something that could be grasped and its memory to a point controlled. The debt to the dead was to remember and to carry the message forward. Nations, as well as individuals, grieved. After a nation's collective horror of war, it was the duty and godsend of king and priest to tend the national grief through ritual, prayer, and music. Psychological healing was a broad necessity. If the first part of this book is about trauma and building back from experiences of war, the second, Healers of the Mind, centers on psychotherapy, medication, and other treatments for psychological suffering. The emphasis is on healers, priests, physicians, psychotherapists, and on psychological treatment rather than medication. This is not because medication is less important, for it is not, but because in recent years, psychotherapy has been relegated to the sidelines. This has been to the detriment of doctor and patient alike.